Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to episode 50 of It's Murder Up North. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you to the Red Rum podcast, Lydia and Fiona Daisy, for your 5-star reviews. Thank you so much for your wonderful words. I also want to welcome the latest Patreon member, Sidus. Thank you for supporting the show. If you want to support the show, you can do so by telling your friends and family about it, leaving reviews on iTunes, or becoming a Patreon member at patreon.com/itsmurderupnorth. There is also a Facebook discussion group where you can interact with fellow listeners, and you can follow the show on Twitter. So now to the podcast of the week, and it is called Once Upon a Nightmare, hosted by Lorraine. She covers horror movies, and she just has this wonderful way of making you want to rewatch the films as soon as you finish listening. Here is a sneak peek.
Hello, this is Lorraine, your host from Once Upon a Nightmare. Every Tuesday I like to delve into the horrors of the world, be it fiction or real. I've had a healthy and what some will call a strange obsession with true crime and horror movies for well over 30 years now. So if those two topics pique your interest, then please go check out Once Upon a Nightmare podcast. It is available on multiple platforms, and don't forget to rate, review and subscribe. Thank you.
Now, let's head to the episode. As of the beginning of 2021, there were approximately 60 inmates serving whole life terrorists in the UK. Such sentences are reserved for the most heinous crimes, and for one to be handed to an individual, exceptional circumstances must be met for someone to be eligible for a whole life term. The Crime Prosecution Service lists the terms under which such sentences are acceptable. These include the murder of 2 or more persons, where each murder involves a substantial degree of premeditation, the abduction of the victim, or sexual or sadistic conduct. The murder of a child, if involving the abduction of the child or sexual or sadistic motivation. A murder done for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause. Or a murder by an offender previously convicted of murder. There are, however, a number of aggravating factors that must be taken into consideration, and these are, quote, a significant degree of planning or premeditation. The victim was vulnerable because of age or disability, mental or physical suffering inflicted on the victim before death, the abuse of a position of trust, the use of duress or threats against another person to facilitate the commission of the offence. The victim was providing a public service or performing a public duty, and concealment, destruction or dismemberment of the body. There are also a number of mitigating factors a judge must take into consideration before handing out the sentence. These include an intention to cause serious bodily harm rather than kill, a lack of premeditation, the offender suffers from a mental disorder or disability that does not fall within Section 2 of the Homicide Act 1957. This states that a person who kills or is a party to the killing of another is not to be convicted of murder if they are suffering from an abnormality of mental functioning, which lowers their degree of culpability. Other factors include the offender was provoked in a way not amounting to a defence of provocation. The offender acted to any extent in self-defence, a belief by the offender that the murder was an act of mercy, or the age of the offender. However, some of those who were serving such terms were not happy with their sentence of life without the possibility of parole, and as such, they launched appeals to the European Court of Human Rights. In 2008, representatives for these prisoners took the case to Europe. The claimants included Jeremy Bamber, who had been sentenced for the murders of his adopted parents his sister, and his twin nephews, who were just 6 years old at the time. Douglas Vinter, who served 10 years in prison for killing a work colleague in 1996. Upon his release, he went on to murder his estranged wife, and while in prison for her murder, he attacked fellow inmate Roy Whiting, who had murdered 8-year-old Sarah Payne. The third was Peter Moore, who decided to murder and mutilate 4 men, in his words, for fun, as well as committing approximately 40 sexual assaults. He was sentenced to life without parole in 1996. They were joined by Arthur Hutchinson, whose crimes are covered in this episode. Despite a number of appeals between 2008 and 2017, their claims were rejected and their whole life sentences upheld. During one appeal, all 3 High Court judges described Arthur Hutchinson's crimes as, quote, a truly shocking case. In the experience of all 3 members of this court, we can say that none of us is aware of a case of greater gravity or more heinous than this case. On the 19th of February 1941, Louise Riordan welcomed her son Arthur. He would be one of 6 children, living in a home in the Oughton Manor area of Hartlepool, in the northeast of England. Louise was married to Cuthbert Riordan, who was the father of 4 of her children. However, Arthur and one of his siblings was the offspring of a lodger called Arthur Hutchinson, although the true extent of the relationship between Louise and Arthur Sr. is not completely clear. In 1945, 4-year-old Arthur contracted meningitis, which his mother later claimed was the reason her son struggled academically. It was noted from an early age that the child had a mean streak. It was reported that he would bully and tease other children, and at the age of 7, Arthur would commit his first violent act, wounding his sister with a pair of scissors. His nephew Dino told the crime and investigation documentary The Killer in My Family about the incident. Quote, when he was 7, he stabbed one of his sisters, and some of the other half-brothers and sisters. They sort of did totally disown him, and almost pretend he didn't exist. As a teenager, he began stealing cars and had several indecent assaults on his record. He did, however, secure a job as a coal miner, but he failed to stay in the role when he breached safety regulations and was subsequently sacked. After losing this job, he managed to secure short-lived employment working as a farm labourer, and then on a fairground where he allegedly entertained audiences by having boxing matches with kangaroos. By the age of 27, he had married a local woman, with some reports stating that she had been his neighbour. The relationship, however, was short-lived, riddled with violence and sexual abuse. After 3 years, his wife left him. In June 1972, a year after the breakdown of his marriage, Hutchinson would receive his first prison sentence. Charged with 3 counts of unlawful sexual intercourse, he was ordered to spend 3.5 years behind bars. After leaving prison, and disowned by most of his family, Hutchinson was taken in by his brother Dino Sr., who allowed him to stay in a property rent-free. But Dino soon discovered that Arthur was fraudulently claiming benefits, and the brothers fell out. During the documentary The Killer in My Family, Hutchinson's nephew recalled the disagreement between the brothers, stating, "My father turfed him out of the house, which obviously angered Arthur." Dino continued to describe his uncle's reaction to the argument, quote, "My father worked the night shift and was going on his motorbike to work, and I would probably expect Arthur was hiding over there, got himself a gun and waited for the opportune moment. Arthur took aim at his brother, but he missed his target, and was later arrested and charged for possession of a firearm and attempted murder. While on remand for this incident, Hutchinson appeared in court accused of theft and burglary, for which he was given an 18-month sentence. 2 months later, he was in court again, to face the charge of possession of a firearm and attempted murder, and Hutchinson was given a 5-year prison term. His time behind bars did little to stop his criminal behaviour, and shortly after he was released, he was arrested once more, this time for rape, theft and burglary. but he was determined not to stand trial for these offences, and while being held on remand, Hutchinson was able to escape through a window of Selby Magistrates' Court and flee the area. He managed to evade capture, but he couldn't resist his criminal urges, and his next crime would be considered one of the most heinous acts in UK criminal history, and would cast his name into infamy. The 23rd of October, 1983 was a day filled with happy memories and hopes for the future, as Susan Laitner married Ivor Wolfe before 200 guests. Following the ceremony, the happy couple headed to their reception, held in a marquee in the grounds of the Laitner family home. Music played, champagne flowed, excited chatter filled the air, and a photographer captured the smiles of those gathered, happy moments frozen in time, permanent reminders of the happiest day of Susan's life. Images of the bride posing with her family, her brother Richard, her sister Nicola, who was a bridesmaid, and their proud parents. These images captured a day that Susan would always remember as the happiest day of her life, but they would also be painful reminders of the worst day of her life, as these were the final photos of her close-knit family, which were to be destroyed by the callous and inexplicable actions of Arthur Hutchinson. As the bride and groom drove away from the house, heading off on their honeymoon, their guests waved to them from the driveway, before they too began to leave the Laitners' property. As the crowds dwindled, the sounds of merriment diminished, and the exhausted family took a moment to just sit in the empty marquee, now vacant except for the empty chairs, tables, and champagne flutes. 18-year-old Nicola headed off to bed first, and as the night grew dark and the pleasant chill of autumn began to make their skin tingle with cold, the rest of the family followed suit. The white marquee billowed in the wind outside, the lights dimmed, and the house now silent. It was under the cloak of darkness that the figure emerged, creeping cautiously across the freshly clipped grass. It skulked silently like an animal hunting its prey. It had been stalking them in the shadows. It had heard the music and laughter. It had observed the joy. And now it had come to bring terror. Stealthily it shifted through the patio doors, and made its way into the home, where the family had settled down to sleep. Without a creak the shadow made its way up the staircase, clinging to the darkest corners. Slowly slithering into an unlit bedroom, the silver blade shining as it was brought down upon the figure in the bed. The sleeping form gasped as the knife was plunged into their flesh. 28-year-old Richard was awoken from his sleep by the searing pain of the knife, but he did not have time to react. The attack was swift, and as quickly as it started, it was over. Richard was a gifted and ambitious man. He had studied law and was making a name for himself as a brilliant barrister. He was an intelligent individual. Having finished his law degree, he had recently started studying to become a doctor. Everyone who knew him described the bright future that was ahead of him, now stolen as he lay dying upon the bed. Superintendent Stewart, who would lead the investigation into the crime, stated, quote, "It was the worst case I have ever handled in my career. Both from the family's point of view, and because of the killings, it was savage, a tremendous loss of a brilliant family. Richard Laitner, particularly, had a brilliant career ahead of him. It was lost with 2 slashes of a knife." The sound of the struggle had woken 59-year-old Basil Laitner from his slumber. Leaving the master bedroom, which was located on the ground floor, he had started to make his way up the stairs to investigate the noise. There he was accosted by a shadowy figure fleeing from his son's room. Basil Laitner was a well-respected solicitor. He had built a successful career, coming from humble beginnings as the son of a Russian immigrant. His law firm was now one of the most prominent in the county of Yorkshire. The house in which they now resided had been built under his instruction, using the wealth he had accumulated from years of hard work. Having moved in the previous year, he was proud to provide his family with a comfortable home in an affluent area. It was on the staircase of his dream home that he was overpowered by the physically superior intruder. Basil Laitner was unable to fight back against his attacker. He collapsed at the foot of the stairs, helpless as the assailant made their way towards the light emitting from the master bedroom, where his 55-year-old wife was alone. Basil and Avril were a year away from their 30th wedding anniversary. Having married in 1954, within a year of their wedding they had welcomed Richard, followed 2 years later by their daughter Susan, whose wedding they had been celebrating that day. In 1962, Jonathan Laitner was born, but his life would be cut short by a tragic accident just 2 years later, when in the August of 1967 he drowned in a pond. A year later, in August 1965, the Laitners welcomed their youngest daughter, Nicola. All those who knew the family recalled them being a close unit. Basil and Avril were devoted to their children and showered them with love and encouraged them to follow their dreams. It was clear that they would do anything for their children, and in those final moments of Basil's life, he had been prevented from protecting them by the brutality of the wounds he had suffered. The intruder entered the master bedroom, where he viciously attacked 55-year-old Avril, although she tried to defend herself from the blood-soaked blade. Her efforts were in vain, and despite her fighting bravely, she succumbed to 26 stab wounds inflicted on her body. Avril was as incredible and brave in life as she was in death. Born on the 27th of April 1928, she worked as a doctor specialising in the care of children with hearing problems. A well-respected member of the medical community, Dr. Laitner was also a cancer survivor. His life and career was remembered in the British Medical Journal, published on the 26th of November 1983, in which they stated, quote, Avril Frampton was born in Sheffield, and after completing her schooling at Abbott's Bromley School, entered the medical school at Sheffield University, from which she graduated in 1953. She was a popular student and recently organised a successful 30-year reunion in Sheffield, which attracted people from many parts of the world. After residency posts in medicine at the Royal Infirmary and Paediatric Surgery at the Children's Hospital, she married in 1954 and continued to work part-time. Initially in general practice, and more recently mainly in relation to children's services, and particularly with deaf children. Avril Laitner was a conscientious doctor, with high standards of moral, ethical and professional dedication. She showed similar moral fibre after the tragic death of her 2-year-old son in a drowning accident in 1964, and in her subsequent, prolonged battle against breast cancer. It is particularly ironic that at the time when she seemed finally to have won this battle, and to have once again got on top of things after these adversities, and at a time of so much jubilation for the whole family, her life ended in such a horrific and tragic way. She will be sadly missed by her many friends and colleagues, for whom she always had an open home and a warm reception. Having subdued Richard and his parents, the man turned his attention to their youngest daughter, 18-year-old Nicola, the little girl who had brought joy into a grieving home following the accidental death of her brother Jonathan. The man made his way up the staircase, where Basil Laitner lay motionless, passing the room where Richard now lay silent. Nicola was now alone and defenceless, as the dark figure entered the frightened girl's bedroom. The shadowy silhouette stood over her bed, the cold tip of the knife pressed firmly against her neck, as he whispered a threat that if she screamed she would die. He ordered the trembling girl to her feet, and forced her to descend the staircase, her feet becoming coated in her father's blood as she passed his lifeless body. Her abductor forced her out into the garden, marching her barefoot across the cold grass. The girl shivered with a mix of fear and the chilly night air against her skin, as dressed only in a nightgown she was directed into the empty marquee. Inside was dark, and only the sound of the panels flapping in the breeze echoed about the space. The man forced her to the ground and handcuffed her before proceeding to rape her. After the assault, he ordered the girl to her feet and made her return to the house. Once again ascending the stairs, past her father's body, the man forced her onto the bed, where he stayed with her for hours, subjecting her to 2 more assaults before tying her up and making his escape. The horrific and senseless crime was uncovered the following day, when 2 workmen arrived to dismantle the marquee. While the men worked, they heard the shrill, trembling voice of Nicola, as she stood on a first-floor balcony in a dirty nightgown, still bound and sobbing, with dry blood upon her feet. 3 days after her traumatic ordeal, Nicola was asked to describe the attacker to the sketch artist, although investigators were unsure whether her memory may have been clouded by her ordeal. Nicola was able to provide a detailed description of the man who had killed her family. This sketch was so accurate that officers immediately recognised the perpetrator as Arthur Hutchinson, who had fled from Selby Magistrates' Court in North Yorkshire and had been named as a wanted man. The police received a letter from the fugitive, which mainly taunted them, likening their efforts to finding him as being akin to a bunch of Boy Scouts, and the discovery of a tape in a property which police believed the killer had sought refuge revealed how Hutchinson had evaded capture. The audio tape began with the wanted man labelling himself as the Fox, and went on to explain the nickname was because of his cunning ways. He proceeded to explain his escape from the magistrates' court in Selby. He had asked to use the restroom, and found himself alone in an empty courtroom, where he was able to make good his escape. On the tape he stated, "I hurled myself through an upper window, crashing into a barbed wire net, ripping my leg to pieces." Despite the injury to his leg, Hutchinson claimed he fled the scene before, quote, "I stopped in the bushes for hours. Then I see the helicopter hunt. So I dragged myself into the gutter, crawled along the gutter and forced myself into bramble bushes and stayed there till it got dark." Under the cover of night, he travelled for approximately 4 miles. He stated that he had stayed in the wilderness as much as possible, journeying only by night and surviving by eating weeds and roots, until 4 days after his escape, when he discovered he was unable to go any further due to the wound on his knee. By this time he was now 20 miles away from Selby, in the town of Doncaster, where he was forced to seek medical attention for his injury. He presented himself to doctors at Doncaster Royal Infirmary, who treated his wound and prescribed him with medication to help stave off infection. As soon as his wound was treated, the man left before the doctors had an opportunity to notify the police. He continued to explain on the tape, quote, "I got my treatment, left, and walked another 3 to 4 miles back into the wilderness. You just have to keep continuing sometimes. I just had to live day by day, but I won't give in. I'll never give in, even when they shoot me, else finish me off." It was also discovered that at some point during his flight, Hutchinson had acquired a transistor radio, which had enabled him to monitor police activity. And in the recording he taunted them by stating, "Like playing cat and mouse, or should I say, fox on the trot," which he followed with a boastful laugh. Hutchinson was believed to have headed south after leaving Doncaster, and police would find he had been in Worksop and Nottingham. But they were always 1 step behind him. In October the fugitive headed north once more, and on the 23rd of October it was believed he had been hiding in a field near to the Laitner home, from which he had observed the wedding reception. Coldly, Hutchinson states on the tape, "I'm making no comments on the triple killings. Let the police do what they want, I'm saying nowt. They knew I was finished, but it makes no difference whether they shoot me for this or anything else. If they think I'm dangerous, let them think that. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. I'm still free, and that's the main thing. However crackers I might be. I've walked past them several times and they haven't even noticed me. Like I say, I am a master of disguise." End quote. After committing the murders in Sheffield, it is speculated that Hutchinson zigzagged across the north of England, first heading towards Manchester, then back across the Pennine Hills to York. He proceeded to make his way to the coastal town of Scarborough, and then headed north to Darlington, from where police had recovered the audio tape. By this time, however, investigators believed that their suspect was doing what one officer claimed most animals would do when they are seeking safety. They would head home. This theory led to them placing surveillance on Hutchinson's mother's house in Hartlepool, and placing a tap on her phone, The officer's hunch was confirmed when Louise received a call from her son in which Hutchinson told her he was coming home. On the 5th of November 1983, as Hutchinson made his way across a turnip field on the outskirts of the village of Dalton Percy, he was apprehended by officers. His flight ended by the bite of a police dog. The fugitive was within 2 miles of his house. Arthur Hutchinson appeared at Durham Crown Court, his 5'9" slender figure flanked by 2 equally tall and well-built officers, to whom the defendant was shackled, a measure to prevent him from escaping again. The trial took place in late July 1984, and following an application by the Sheffield newspaper group, the judge, Mr. Justice McNeill, made the decision that, contrary to the Sexual Offence Act, the name of the defendant and his victim, Nicola Laitner, could be reported in the press, stating that it was, quote, in the public interest for that the restrictions be removed. Prosecutor Mr. Robin Stewart, QC, presented what he called a chilling and horrendous case to the jury. Guiding them through the events surrounding the murders, he highlighted that the Laitner family were well-respected members of the Jewish community in Sheffield, and had spent the morning of October the 23rd at the synagogue where their eldest daughter's wedding took place. He continued to describe how the newlyweds were joined by over 200 guests for their reception in the grounds of the Laitner family home, and disclosed that the occasion cost Mr. Laitner £10,000, which is approximately £30,000 in today's money. Robin Stewart stated that, quote, it started as a supremely happy day, and it should have ended that way. The day ended in the most appalling tragedy, with the murder of the Laitner parents and Richard, and the rape of Nicola, while she was raped repeatedly until the attacker left, leaving her tied up with the reality that she was the only one to survive this slaughter. He proceeded to explain how the attacker had first fatally wounded the eldest son Richard while he was asleep in bed, killing him with just 2 stab wounds, and thus eliminating the main threat in the house, as Richard would have been the one who would have most likely overpowered the defendant, but he was never given the opportunity. The prosecutor then proceeded to explain how 59-year-old Basil Laitner was attacked as he ascended the stairs on his way to investigate the disturbance. Once again, he was incapacitated. Hutchinson attacked 55-year-old Avril Laitner, who fought him, her hands and arms showing her valiant yet futile efforts. In detail, he told the jury about the, quote, ordeal of rape that 18-year-old Nicola was subjected to, recalling how the defendant had told the teenager, "Scream and you will be dead." The defendant then subjected the young girl to a series of sexual assaults, while being held at knife point, and that she was made to walk past her father's lifeless body twice, which only added to the horrific ordeal. With the prosecutor highlighting that, quote, the event would leave Nicola scarred for a long, long time. They were events which may strike you as spine-chilling and horrendous. Home Office pathologist Professor Alan Usher testified regarding the cause of death of each victim, reiterating the brutality and swiftness of the attack. He concluded that all 3 members of the Laitner family had died from shock and hemorrhaging due to multiple stabbing. Amongst the witnesses called to testify was George Wordsworth, who recalled attending the Laitner home on the 24th of October with a colleague tasked with dismantling the wedding marquee. He told the court how he and his colleague had been messing around while clearing out the marquee, describing how his friend had been sipping the leftover champagne to, quote, toast the bridegroom, a description which evoked laughter in the courtroom. Yet this quickly dissipated as the workman proceeded with his testimony. Mr. Wordsworth told the jury that they had been on the premises for approximately 10 minutes, when they heard what he described as sobbing, like a child who had hurt herself. He recalled how he looked up to a first-floor balcony, where he saw the trembling figure of Mr. Laitner's youngest daughter, dressed in what he called a flimsy nightie. He continued stating that the teenager was sobbing and asking, "Can you help? Can you help me? Can you help my daddy?" The trial would prove to be fraught with harrowing moments. including the playing of a 7-minute video of a crime scene recorded by the police as they investigated the murders. Despite its graphic nature, the jury would request to view this video a second time during deliberations. The footage opened with an external shot of the Laitners' home, including the marquee and the rubbish that had been left over from the wedding reception. It then proceeds to show the patio door through which the defendant was believed to have entered. Proceeding to the ground floor master bedroom, the camera operator pans the room, showing that the room had been ransacked. The lens then focuses on the floor and the body of Mrs. Laitner, positioned face down beside the bed, her white patterned nightgown stained with blood, primarily on her left side. It was pointed out to the jury that numerous items of value had been stolen from the property, namely items of jewellery. The camera then heads into the hallway, where Mr. Laitner lay face down in 3 distinct pools of blood. His clothing revealed a large blood stain about his shoulders and upper back. Once again the camera panned about her room, this time the bedroom of Richard Laitner. There were clear signs of cast-off, coating the bedding, walls and furniture. The 28-year-old's face had been covered in blood, and he lay in an awkward position, half hanging off the bed, with his arms held across his chest as though defending himself. The jury was told that there were various pieces of blood evidence retrieved from the scene, particularly from the nightgown Nicola had been wearing that night, which was presented to the court. Blood spots on the collar of the dress were deemed to have belonged to Mrs. Laitner, and additional samples recovered from the hem were identified as Mr. Laitner's blood. This corresponded with the blood that had been found on the sole of Nicola's right foot, which helped investigators to determine that the parents had been attacked prior to the assault on their daughter. Forensic evidence also helped tie Hutchinson to the crime scene. It was presented that a sample of blood was recovered from Nicola's bedding. This blood type was found to be present in only 1 in 50,000 people, making it extremely rare, and it just so happened that Arthur Hutchinson was one of those 50,000. The prosecution argued that the staining on the sheet was consistent with the attacker having a knee injury, which had bled while he knelt over his victim. The jury was asked to consider how many people in the population with that group might also have a wound on their knee like Arthur Hutchinson did. It was also alleged that Hutchinson spent some time in the property, not only to torment Nicola, but he also helped himself to some wine and cheese. A palm print was lifted from the bottle, which was confirmed as the defendant's, and an impression of a bite mark in the cheese would subsequently match Hutchinson's teeth. The most anticipated moment of the trial came when Arthur Hutchinson stood to testify. He was described as, quote, dressed casually in maroon slacks, a light open-neck shirt and light blue V-neck sweater, flanked by 2 prison officers. Hutchinson fielded questions from both the prosecution and the defence. Answering in a strong Northern English accent, he appeared calm despite the circumstances he found himself in. During his time on the stand, the defendant claimed that he had met Nicola previously, and that she had invited him to her home for sex. He proceeded to allege that after they had consensual intercourse, he left the Laitners' home, all of whom were alive when he exited the property. The defendant was asked, "Did you kill Basil Laitner? Did you kill Avril Laitner? Did you kill Richard Laitner?" Each question was answered with a simple no. The prosecutor then asked, "Did you rape Nicola Laitner?" Hutchinson replied, "No," and continued by stating, "It was definitely with her consent." He proceeded to claim that the 18-year-old had taken him to her bedroom, where they listened to music and danced. They then started kissing and began to undress. He alleged that they, quote, made love 3 times without handcuffs. The defendant described how on the 21st of October he had encountered Nicola Laitner while trying to order a drink at the crowded bar of the Lion pub in Sheffield. He alleged that he got into a conversation with the teenager and her friends, who were out celebrating her sister's upcoming nuptials. Hutchinson then suggested that during the course of the evening, Nicola had invited him to attend the wedding reception, to which he allegedly replied, "Don't you think I'm out of your age group, pet?" referring to the fact that he was 24 years her senior. He then claimed that a friend of Nicola's responded to this by telling Hutchinson to, quote, "not be a spoilsport." The defendant proceeded to suggest that this friend was in the courtroom, and he pointed to Mark Barron, while stating that if they wanted to know who the real murderer was, maybe they should look at him, insinuating that Mr. Barron had told Nicola to invite Hutchinson to the reception and was using the defendant as a scapegoat to avoid being identified as the real culprit. There was, however, no basis for this claim, which Mike Barron later called preposterous and false, insisting that, quote, "the first time I saw Nicola was in this court. I'd never heard of the Laitner family before this case." Hutchinson's accusations did not end at murder. He also claimed that Mike Barron had been threatening his elderly mother, which Mike Barron vehemently denied. Mr. Barron found himself having to defend his reputation by providing an alibi for the weekend of the wedding. It transpired that Mike Barron was a newspaper reporter who could prove that on the night Hutchinson alleged he was in the Lion Pub in Sheffield, he was actually 140 miles away, conducting an interview with a milkman for a news story. He was also able to provide witnesses who could prove that he had been at home with his wife and some dinner guests on the night of the murders. This alibi, backed by witness testimony and evidence at the crime scene, all culminated to prove that Hutchinson's accusations were false, and subsequently called into question his claim of meeting Nicola in the pub 2 nights before her family were murdered. For Nicola Laitner, her ordeal was far from over. As a key witness, she was called to testify and relive the horror of that night, knowing that her name and every word would be published in the press for people to scrutinise and twist. Outside the courtroom, there was a difference of opinion. Some argued that they believed she was involved in the incident, that she had willingly invited the killer into the home, and some went as far as suggesting that she had been complicit in the attacks. While others, including some women's charities, were astounded that the victim's name had been allowed to be made public, and fought to remind people that Nicola was an 18-year-old girl who had been through an awful experience for which she should not be judged. Nicola spoke of the events of that night with a trembling yet dignified manner, all while in the gaze of the man who had slaughtered her family and sexually assaulted her. After 9 days the trial concluded, and the jury were sent to deliberate with specific instructions from the judge. He reminded them, quote, "You must not allow yourselves to be influenced against the defendant either by horror or revulsion at the video recordings and the still pictures of the killings which you have seen. Secondly, you must not allow yourselves to be influenced by the fact that the defendant was sitting in the dock, handcuffed to a prison officer." The judge highlighted that there was no doubt regarding the defendant's mental state, imploring the jury to ignore any suggestions that his actions were due to insanity. He also urged them that although they will have been privy to press coverage pertaining to the events surrounding the murders and the defendant's flight from authorities, they must cast aside any preconceived ideas and focus solely on the evidence and information presented during the trial. With the judge's words ringing in their ears, the jury retired. The 6 men and 6 women took just 4 hours to reach their decision. They found Arthur Hutchinson guilty on 3 counts of murder and guilty of the additional charge of rape. As Judge McNeil passed sentence, Arthur Hutchinson was instructed to stand. He continued to demonstrate a calm manner as the terms were read out, with the judge commenting on the defendant's manner, stating that Hutchinson was calm, confident, arrogant, self-centred and unreliable, changing his story to achieve the biggest effect. There was no evidence of delusions or suggestions of mental illness. He is arrogant and has a manipulative approach to life, which indicates a personality disorder. The judge concluded that you know that the only sentence can be passed on you is a sentence of life, adding that the minimum term he will serve is 18 years, which would have meant he would have been eligible for release in 2002. Superintendent Ted Stewart commented on the trial, in particular paying tribute to the strength and bravery of Nicola Laitner. He stated, quote, "She should be a national heroine. She did nothing wrong, and the verdict should silence critics' tongues." He also responded to the fact that her name was allowed to be made public. Defending the decision, he said, "I think to some extent it has shown the seriousness of this case. The story is out. One cannot have any doubt whatsoever about what happened." He also reiterated the fact that Nicola was a victim, a survivor, and was in no way complicit in the murders. He strongly reiterated that any suggestion that Nicola had known Hutchinson prior to that night were totally unfounded, concluding that, quote, "I have been satisfied from the outset that there was not a jot of truth in the wild allegations against her." As for Hutchinson's mother, Louise, who had stood by her son, unable to accept that he could be capable of such a heinous crime, at first insisted that, quote, "I'm never going to believe that he did it. I can never think he did it, but he's gone from me forever. I can't see him anymore. I can't see him after this. I don't want to see him anymore." Early on in his incarceration, 79-year-old Louise would spend hundreds of pounds travelling to see Arthur in prison, but she now refuses to communicate with her son and struggles to come to terms with the reality of his crimes. Not long after Hutchinson was imprisoned, the Home Secretary, Leon Britton, reviewed the terms of the inmate's sentence, and he deemed it was too lenient for the severity of the crime. He ordered that Arthur Hutchinson would have his sentence increased to indefinite incarceration, without the prospect of parole, which started Hutchinson on the road to appealing this decision. His appeals failed. He is currently 80 years old and remains behind bars. Following their deaths, the Laitner family were remembered by the communities that had held them in such high regard. 28-year-old Richard Laitner had been studying for a degree in medicine at Sheffield University, and a memorial fund was set up in his name to assist aspiring doctors in the future. For Basil and Avril, who had been married for almost 30 years and had faced the loss of a child and a battle with cancer while excelling in their careers, donations were made towards cancer research. Not much is known about Susan. She and her husband apparently left Sheffield and moved to London to try and move on from the tragedy. Nicola was also to have rumoured to have left Sheffield. According to records, she married and had children of her own, and it is believed that Nicola resided in Ireland until she passed away in 2013. Thank you for joining me for episode 50 of It's Murder Up North. Episode 51 will be available next week. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.